Hello, today is Friday, February 21st. Welcome to episode 417 of Fault Lines, the National Security Institute's podcast that gets you quickly up to speed 3 times a week on the national security and foreign policy debate shaking up America. I'm NSI Advisory Board member Lester Munson, and I'm joined today by NSI Fellow Jessica Jones and NSI Visiting Fellow Algene. Today, we are going to talk about Senator Mitch McConnell. He is the senior senator from the great state of Kentucky. He is the former leader of the Republican conference in the U.S. Senate. He was minority leader. He was majority leader, I believe one of the longest serving leaders in Senate history. He announced this week that he is retiring after 6 terms in the Senate. That's 42 years, folks. That's 2 generations. The reason we're talking about something that's not necessarily a national security issue is because I think Senator McConnell has been an incredible factor in a lot of foreign policy issues that the U.S. government has faced over the past few years, and has been a incredibly important voice in the Republican Party in particular for the international leadership approach to the world that is changing before our eyes just in the last month. A number of huge changes that are going on. The world where Mitch McConnell was a leader in the Republican Party and a voice for the United States engaging abroad and providing leadership abroad is changing to something very different. And so I think we can pause this Friday. It's not a fun Friday. It's maybe a reflective Friday to talk about his leadership. He played critical roles on Ukraine, on the Middle East, on NATO, on U.S. policy towards China. Every single major issue, Mitch McConnell convened the rest of the important Republican senators, kind of formed a national security council in the Senate and provided advice to presidents of both parties, was a bulwark against, I think, the excesses on the left and some of the really mistaken policies on the right that led to the U.S. Having a more feckless foreign policy. I think he was a voice, still is kind of a voice, but he's a voice that's leaving the stage, a voice for American leadership in the world that is, and this is no slight to Senator Thune, who is replacing him as the majority leader, as the leader for the Republicans in the Senate. I think he's a perfectly good senator. He's right on a lot of issues. There's no slight against him, but Mitch McConnell stepping off the stage is a big deal and a pivot point here in foreign policy for our country, particularly on the Republican side, as the new Trump administration comes in and effectively is siding with Russia in the war in Ukraine, is signaling the need to do deals to settle things across the world, regardless of our values and interests in many cases. So I know I'm not speaking for all 3 of us here. There are some fault lines in our interpretation of Mr. McConnell's legacy. Algene, I want to go to you first. Thanks for being on the podcast today. Love to know what you think about Senator McConnell.
I think first and foremost, Senator McConnell is a brilliant political tactician. He's a brilliant strategist. He knew how to use the rules of the Senate to, while in the minority, really affect the ability of the majority to achieve its goals. And so he's actually a brilliant strategist. Unfortunately, his amazing master of the strategy, it's hard to believe that with his knowledge of what he was able to do and what he was able to achieve, that he doesn't understand how what he did eroded the power of the individual senator, and how much his actions actually led to the erosion of the institution itself. And so, having served myself 10 years in the House, 8 years in the Senate, I worry that the Senate is becoming too much like the House. And a lot of that has to do with the way that Senator McConnell managed the Senate and the rules that were eroded and the powers that were eroded for individual senators. And so I'm really disappointed that we are here. But I do have to give credit where it's due. I call him the evil genius because he was absolutely brilliant at what he did.
Algene, I'm going to disagree with you on the erosion of the Senate question. That, in my view, completely started with Harry Reid tearing down the filibuster because he wanted to get a couple of judges on the D.C. Circuit Court or the D.C. Court of Appeals, and that unleashed the whirlwind of dismantling the protections for the minority in the Senate that we're living with today. Mitch McConnell warned against it at the time, was vociferous, was totally opposed to what Reid did. That was a Harry Reid decision, and I think every single consequence since then is on his shoulders. That is my personal view. Jones, I think you have a slightly different approach to Senator McConnell.
Les, I was excited when you picked this topic because I wanted to hear you spell out the reasons why Mitch McConnell, this decision to not run for re-election was so monumental. Because you lay out, his belief in U.S. global leadership, alliances, NATO, roles when it comes to policies in the Middle East and Ukraine. And had he still been leading on those issues, I would think this would be a monumental moment, but I don't see leadership on those issues. So is McConnell's departure the pivot, or is it just the second Trump administration and the reaction from the Senate and from the Congress overall to dealing with the new administration? That's actually the monumental shift, right? Like for me, I was, joking a little bit that I didn't even get an alert on my phone that that McConnell was retiring, because there's an overwhelming amount of news right now when it comes to layoffs, which new agency is the target of DOJ, what DOJ is looking at my private records. There's a lot going on. And that has nothing to do with even like discussions when it comes to Ukraine, when it comes to Gaza. And so this kind of gets lost. And my first thought is, well, I guess because what is Congress doing on any of these things? It's an important, as you and Algene, you guys are the inside baseball. You served there. You know how important it is as an institution. But we don't hear much from it. We talk about advise and consent, and it's been mainly consent of Trump nominees, a lot of which have been, critical national security roles. In, McConnell's retirement speech, he talks about national security and rule of law, and then a little bit later, he votes to confirm Kash Patel. So it's a little hard as the spectator to what's going on in Congress, someone who hasn't been on the inside, to see kind of how his departure is monumental. Because perhaps had it been 8 years ago, 10 years, had it been years ago, you could see that. But right now, I'm wondering why hasn't he come out on these positions a lot louder to defend U.S. global engagement?
Well, I think to answer at least some of that, first of all, he's certainly not perfect, and I may argue with him on some of his votes, particularly with respect to the first term of President Trump. But Mitch McConnell did vote against, had the courage to vote against some of Trump's nominees, along with Senator Collins and Senator Murkowski, that he felt weren't appropriate to be in the cabinet. He wasn't alone in doing that, but there weren't a lot of Republicans with him. He showed some courage there. On the Kash Patel nomination, we can agree to disagree, but McConnell was more willing than most senators to go against the president of his own party, which is a difficult thing to do. It echoes what he's done on a lot of issues, where he was willing to take the unpopular position, including on something that's totally unrelated to national security. On campaign finance reform, was a voice against too much transparency. He pointed out that would lead to the targeting of donors, which in fact it did. And it was a very unpopular position for him to take, but he was utterly unafraid to go to the floor and talk about it and make his will be known on those issues.
Okay, so you mentioned his support of Ukraine, and I will say, Senate has been silent on Ukraine and President Trump's comments about Zelensky and the war being started by Ukraine. But the only criticism is it's not even from McConnell. Those saying, I wouldn't use the term dictator. Oh, I wouldn't have said no. He hasn't even said anything. What has he said that it has been made public that we can point to?
Well, there have been a lot of senators who have spoken up and said that they think, it's actually Putin who's the dictator and not Zelensky. I mean, that for some reason has become a pivot point in the debate, which of course is totally crazy. But there has been some pushback in the Senate. And folks, the only place where there will be any resistance to this, where there will be any check on the power, is in Congress. That is the only place where it's going to happen. In addition to the courts, the only place where it will happen is in Congress. So it's super important that senators speak up. Mitch McConnell, for over 40 years, has been willing to speak up on difficult issues and take unpopular positions.
Well, I will just add this. Mitch McConnell, yes, he's been willing to speak up. He did, put the blame where it belonged for January 6th insurgency attempts on Donald Trump. But then he went and still did, voted to keep him in power. He's singularly responsible for what is going on right now.
Well, I would say Trump is singularly responsible.
Well, he is for the response in Congress to what is going on right now. His influence you can say one thing but do another, and continue to let a Trump erode the power of the constitutional power of Congress. It's dangerous. And so to say one thing and do another, to lead to set that example for younger senators coming in to the institutions, into the chamber, is dangerous.
All right, we may have to agree to disagree on some of these points, folks, but I think
they're not important.
I think the larger, there's no shrugging here. The larger point that this is a pivot is, I think, bears out. I mean, we might have different views of that pivot. All right, that's a wrap. Thanks so much to Kelly Crowley, Claude Jennings, and the NSI staff for their help in producing today's episode. Join us on Monday, February 24, for another episode of Fault Lines, National Security Institute's podcast that gets you smart fast on the national security and foreign policy debates shaking up America. Fault Lines is now on YouTube, so check out our channel for a video of today's episode. If you like what you heard or saw, be sure to rate, review, and subscribe.